Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. This morning we have a terrific program to talk about one of the most critical issues in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also what has been among the highest priorities for the Inter-American Dialogue for over more than a quarter century. While we've seen some progress in the region in terms of coverage and education, there remain enormous challenges in quality and relevance of education. The human capital in the region is there, but a lack of adequate education and skills training means this is underdeveloped, and these learning deficits contribute to low productivity and to low growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over the last few years, under the intellectual leadership and direction of Ariel Fishbein, the dialogue has pursued this education agenda, this education challenge, with even greater effort and greater imagination and determination. There are two areas in particular where the dialogue has emerged, I think, as a leader at the regional level in promoting sound public policies. The first is early childhood education, which has been ignored in many countries, but the dialogue has worked with its partners in the region to try to advance this priority. And the second is skills training, which is an extremely important area also and involves different stakeholders like the private sector, government officials, civil society, and the like, and we've made those connections to try to advance a very positive agenda in this area. Ariel Fishbein has collaborated with Sarah Stanton, who's the program associate in education, to produce the superb report that we're launching this morning, which looks in a detailed and very thorough way on the state of education, future of education in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also highlights the possibilities for greater U.S. and more effective U.S. investment and U.S. engagement in this critical area, in this critical sector. So congratulations to Ariel and to Sarah for producing an excellent report. The U.S. government, mainly through USAID, but also other agencies, has done important work as well over the long period of time in supporting education efforts in the region. This is the kind of cooperation that rarely captures headlines in newspapers, like issues like trade and immigration tend to dominate the headlines, but it's an issue that's been important between Latin America and the Caribbean, between the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean for many decades. And the last session this morning will devote to exploring possibilities for even deeper and greater cooperation in this critical area. And I want to give special thanks to USAID for the support in this report, and Michael Listman, our dialoguer. Thank you very much for your collaboration and cooperation in this. There's no one better to kick off this session this morning and to give an address than Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro, who's now in his third term in Congress representing San Antonio and the suburbs. Congressman Castro has been a strong supporter and a close friend of the dialogues for many years. He's participated in a number of our events, most recently a congressional dinner that we had on temporary protected status for Salvadorans. If you review his impressive resume, I think what stands out is not only his lifelong commitment to social justice, to community causes, and to public service, but also to education. That has been a thread that has run through his life. His father, retired teacher, and his mother, renowned community activist. He's a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, and he spent several years as a legislator, state legislator in Texas, in a very difficult political environment, So he's used to difficult political environments from Texas, and that has prepared him well for dealing with the current environment in Washington. And he played always a strong role in bridging divides, transcending differences, and trying to bring funding to critical education programs in Texas. As I said, today is also a very difficult political environment in the U.S. Congress, but Congressman Castro has been a real leader in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which has kept him pretty busy these days, and is also a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves on the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere affairs. So there's no one who's better and who stands at the intersection of education concerns with a commitment and leadership on Latin American issues. We are very privileged to have him with us this morning. We want to thank him for taking time from his busy schedule. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Joaquin Castro.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see all of you here and be with you. Thank you to Michael and the Dialogue for inviting me to be here. My name is Joaquin Castro, and I represent the wonderful city of San Antonio in Texas. And I'm in my third term in Congress and serve, as Michael mentioned, on the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the House Intelligence Committee. And I'd like to thank the Inter-American Dialogue and its president, of course, Michael Shifter, for inviting me to be here today. And also like to thank and congratulate Ariel Fishbein and Sarah Stanton for this excellent and timely report on the future of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. I've always appreciated and admired the Dialogue for delving deep into the issues that affect our hemisphere and for being strong advocates for stronger relations between the United States and Latin America. As somebody who serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and specifically on the Western Hemisphere subcommittee, I've said that oftentimes I feel as though there are things that happen in Latin America that if they happened in other parts of the world would get much more attention. So thank you to the Dialogue for always bringing attention to the issues of Latin America and also for strengthening the relationship. I think this room and the Congress appreciates it. So as this report lays out, education and skills development are critical to allowing folks to unlock their full potential and improve their lives and their communities. The report provides valuable insights into the state of education in Latin America and the Caribbean and proposes concrete policy recommendations that will aid policymakers in the region and here in the United States. And as the report argues, the countries in the region are in the midst of a transformation with young populations that need to prepare for a modern workforce. Governments have noticed implementing policies that have expanded access to secondary and tertiary education through investments and other things, but there's also so much that needs to be done. While primary education is now nearly universal, the quality of that education must increase to meet the needs of a changing global economy. Challenges like income inequality hurt the ability of many in society to improve their position in life through education, as so many of us in the United States have. The report's conclusions that investment in education in Latin America and the Caribbean must both be expanded and refocused will provide valuable guidance for USAID and other U.S. agencies or organizations involved in this field. We have a responsibility to the American taxpayer to make sure their tax dollars are utilized to maximum effect. I believe in the need for foreign assistance. I believe in its importance in our relationships with the other nations of the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere, where the consequences of local conditions directly affect the United States. I've introduced bills in the Congress to promote innovation in foreign assistance, and I'm here with you today because this report and the Dialogue's work is a valuable contribution to improving the effectiveness of such programs. It will also guide the various national education plans for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and the work of international organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. Evidence proves that education is the surest path to success. I believe this for many years, and I'd like us to be clear about what exactly the report is describing and what it's laying out, and what we have benefited from in the United States, and also, quite honestly, what we seek to export to the world, including Latin America. The beauty of this country, and I believe what we must continue to build around the world, is an infrastructure of opportunity. Let me describe to you what I mean by that. Just as there's an infrastructure of transportation, a system of roads and streets and highways that helps all of us get to where we want to go on the road, the beauty of the United States and of what we're building and helping build in other nations is that there is an infrastructure of opportunity that helps people get to where they want to go in life. So when the report speaks about improving education and educational systems, what it's describing is creating an infrastructure so that people can have a strong foundation, whether it's skills development or primary education, secondary education, and higher education, so that they can ultimately go on and pursue their dreams in life. And it's the success of that infrastructure of opportunity that will determine in many ways the economic fate of a country. And I also believe the democratic fate of a nation. So the better Latin America does, the better the United States does. So thank you to the dialogue. Thank you for all of your work in helping develop this report and in developing this relationship. This work is especially vital as we go forward and think about how we can benefit, how we can help our neighbors in Latin America. And as I mentioned earlier, we should always remember that we need to attend to the nations that are closest to us, that have been our allies for so long, economically and also diplomatically. So thank you for this. Congratulations.
Thank you, Congressman Castro, for your excellent remarks and for all of your support on this and other issues. And we'll be looking forward to working with you and your colleagues moving forward on this issue. So thank you so much for joining us. I now want to ask Ariel and Sarah, who are going to present this report, to come forward.
Good morning, everyone. Many thanks for coming here and being present today. And also thanks to people that are watching us online. A lot of people could not make it today. We appreciate Congressman Castro's words and recognition for the role of a dialogue and the report. And let me start by thanking also USAID and its education team in particular for the support that they gave us, not only making it possible to conduct the study, but also providing excellent feedback throughout that really enriched our work. Education is not always at the top of the hemispheric agenda and discussions. But increasingly, over the last decade or so, we've seen it gaining traction and more salience on hemispheric discussions and fora. In fact, I would argue that today education is not only in the hearts, but also in the minds of decision makers. And I make this distinction because sometimes there is a tendency to just think of education as sort of a soft issue that looks good, but actually doesn't have real traction on, at the policy level. And in fact, what we're seeing is that there has been, and there's an increasing transformation that is putting education as a hard issue at the core of the development agenda in Latin America and in the world, for that matter. To a great extent, this has to do with the concern that education gaps, whether they are in terms of coverage or quality, relevance, are really becoming a serious bottleneck for economic development and competitiveness. They are also, as a consequence, also serious bottlenecks for political and social development as well. We have to be honest. These days, there is important changes and transformations at various levels happening both in Latin America and in the United States. And in that sense, we believe this is a good time for all of us to reflect in a serious and systematic way whether education becomes an area that facilitates and promotes and provides opportunities for collaboration, cooperation, engagement, and integration. Suddenly, the soft can become really hard and become really an area of hope. That was the motivation behind this report. We see it as a contribution, food for thought, that we hope will start a conversation not only on the challenges that exist in education policy and education development in Latin America, but also on the opportunities for collaboration, for partnership between the United States, both the United States government, as well as a range of actors in the United States, to really find fruitful collaboration with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. To start that conversation, we'll first hear from Sarah a brief presentation on the report, which by now I suspect you will all have in your inboxes. We're waiting until early today to release the report, so when you go back to your offices or you watch your phones, you'll probably see the report there. We'll start with a brief presentation, and then we'll have two panels. In the first panel, we have a really a distinguished group of representatives from organizations that, from different perspectives, are already engaged from the United States on partnerships with Latin America on education. And we'll have a discussion with them, a really open discussion as to where are the bottlenecks and how we move forward, what needs to happen for this to be taken to the next level. And then we have more of a foreign policy discussion with two distinguished diplomats or former diplomats on the main hypothesis that we're putting forward, that indeed this is an area for hope and positive integration and collaboration. Without further ado, Sarah, the microphone is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here and joining us today as we present this report. And thank you especially to USAID for making this possible. So as Ariel mentioned, this report looks at patterns and trends in education policies and outcomes across the region, as well as in the source, type, and direction of development, assistance, and investment. And it aims to identify spaces for U.S. Latin American partnerships and pathways for new and continued engagement. So I want to begin by giving a general overview of what education outcomes and challenges look like in Latin America and the Caribbean right now. And there are three main issues to consider when we look at education outcomes. And those are coverage, efficiency, and quality. The first area, coverage, is where Latin America and the Caribbean has seen the most progress in recent decades. More students are going to school, they're starting earlier, and they're staying in the system longer. With the exception of just a few countries, which are shown on this slide, primary education is now virtually universal in Latin America and the Caribbean. Access to pre-primary education has also increased substantially since 2000. And secondary education coverage, while still not quite at 100%, has also increased quite significantly in the past decade. We also see that more students are attending higher education, and that access has grown significantly in the past 2 decades. And while the regional average for higher education enrollment is still less than 50%, so less than half of students, what's interesting here is that most of the growth has come from increased secondary graduation rates rather than increased enrollment from secondary graduates. So the new secondary graduates are continuing on to university or other higher education. Now, in the second area that I mentioned, efficiency, there's been less progress than we would hope to see. Despite increased access to education, many students still struggle to move through the system and to complete their schooling. Repetition rates in Latin American and Caribbean countries are concerningly high across all levels of the education system, from primary school all the way through to higher education. To take Haiti as an example, the average student is 16 by the time that he or she completes primary education, which is the equivalent of 6th grade in the United States. Dropout, especially between primary and secondary schools, and then also during secondary education, is a significant challenge, often driven by lack of interest in school, by students' family responsibilities, or by the need to provide financially for the household. At the university level, in many Latin American and Caribbean countries, more than half of students who enroll in tertiary education do not complete a degree. And they often leave after spending at least 2, but in some cases 5 or 6 years in the system. Now, the final education area that I mentioned was education quality. And here we also see that there's reason to be concerned. Not only are Latin American students not achieving basic benchmarks on regional tests, they're also performing well below their peers on international tests. For example, on the Terce exam, which is a regional assessment administered by UNESCO, although there was a slight improvement in scores from the previous iteration, roughly 40% of students achieved scores in the lowest performance level in all subject areas and grade levels. And on the 2015 PISA exam, which is an international assessment administered by the OECD, every single Latin American and Caribbean country scored below the international average in every subject area. So even though students in Latin America and the Caribbean are spending more time in school, it's clear that they're not necessarily learning more, or certainly not as much as they should be given the resources, both in terms of time and money, that are being devoted to the education system. Now, all of these challenges that I've just mentioned are often concentrated, most particularly in communities that are poor, rural, or indigenous, or any combination of those. Therefore, inequality appears in all aspects of educational access, quality, and efficiency. Poor students are less likely to have access to early childhood education programs. They enter the system later and less prepared, and they spend less time in school than their wealthier peers. The education that they receive is often of poorer quality, which is reflected in their significantly higher likelihood of scoring poorly on standardized assessments. And because they are poorly prepared for school and the education that they receive is of low quality, these young people are also more likely to drop out of school and struggle to find work when they do. And this leads to one final important point, which is that of educational relevance. In other words, to what extent the education system prepares students with the skills and knowledge necessary for successfully entering the labor market. And here again, we see significant gaps and bottlenecks. International surveys show that many employers in Latin America have difficulty filling positions and specifically identify an inadequately trained workforce as a significant bottleneck to increasing productivity. Many of these positions are in skilled trades and manufacturing, and studies have shown that the TVET track often offers a better alternative for students who do not plan to continue on to higher education. Unfortunately, despite the increase in secondary enrollment, the percentage of students who enroll in technical and vocational programs has remained stagnant and is below the OECD average in those countries. So low educational relevance and high dropout rates combine to mean that Latin America and the Caribbean as a region has also become known for the phenomenon of ninis, youth who are neither working nor studying. In countries like Honduras, Haiti, Panama, and El Salvador, over 30% of all youth between the ages of 15 and 24 is neither in school nor employed. And these statistics reflect the real inability of education systems in Latin America and the Caribbean to respond to the needs of the labor market and to stimulate human capital production and economic growth. So with the rest of this presentation and also with our conversations on the panels today, what we want to do is address the question of whether going forward, USAID and other US-based actors might have a better way of engaging with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in pursuing their educational strategies, and what is the potential role of other stakeholders and actors, both inside and outside of the government. Now, when considering this question, we want to recognize two factors. The first is that USAID is not the only actor in the region. There are development banks, there are other bilaterals, and there are non-government actors. And not only are there other players, but some of them are much larger than USAID, and they have access to much larger resource pools, which means that USAID needs to consider how to leverage its limited resources to achieve the greatest impact. So in the paper, we develop a typology of countries, grouping countries based on how they perform on a number of key indicators related to the coverage, quality, and relevance outcomes that I just discussed. And also, and that reflects how they do across the educational spectrum from pre-primary all the way through higher education. And that's represented on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we consider the capacity and commitment of these countries to actually undertaking significant policy reforms. So currently, USAID is pursuing a strategy that focuses on a subset of countries within the region which have the greatest needs and the weakest policy environments, and increasingly so. In other words, the countries that appear in the weak column and the weak row. These countries in the upper left-hand corner of the typology struggle in all areas of educational coverage, efficiency, and quality, and they generally have significant relevance bottlenecks. Complicating the situation, these countries also have very weak policy environments. As a rule, they have a weak vision for the education sector without a clear idea of what needs to be improved and how to do it. They don't have the ability to measure student learning in a systematic way or to build better policies based on student learning data. And the governments in these countries dedicate limited resources to the education sector, making it even more difficult to improve current outcomes. Additionally, the education systems in essentially all of these countries face added pressures from outside forces, such as increased vulnerability to climate-related natural disasters, high levels of violent crime, and unstable political environments. These forces are shown via the symbols that you see next to some of the countries: a cloud for climate events, a starburst for violence, and a gear for low support of this political system. Although these pressures are not directly related to the education sector, we definitely realize that they can have a significant impact on the ability of the education sector to function effectively. So on one hand, USAID's decision to work in these countries with the weakest outcomes and the weakest policy environments makes a certain amount of sense. Because of their poor outcomes and their weak policy environments, they face the greatest challenges to improving educational quality. It has also allowed USAID to remain a significant player in the development field in these countries, despite its more limited resources relative to multilateral banks. Whoops. As we see in these graphs, when we look at education funding in the region as a whole, there's no way that USAID can keep up with larger multilateral development banks. When we zoom in, however, to the bottom graph and look specifically at the countries where USAID works, we can see that it is a significant player, that it makes contributions at levels that are comparable to those of much larger multilateral organizations. And when we consider other bilateral agencies, especially in recent years, USAID has become the largest contributor to educational development, particularly in the Central American and Caribbean countries where it has decided to focus its efforts. This is partially because many of the largest bilateral agencies from European countries have chosen to focus their educational development efforts in other regions of the world. Now, all of that said, on the other hand, working in these countries with the weakest outcomes and the weakest policies means taking on the most challenging environments and the greatest gaps. And as we'll see, this has affected the way that USAID engages with these countries and the type of project that it takes on. So it's reasonable that going forward, USAID should ask itself if it wants to stay on this path, focused on the weakest countries and the greatest external pressures, or if there are opportunities to perhaps recalibrate and balance out the way that it works and the type of funding that it engages in. So, it's going too fast for me. When we look at the overlap between what other development agencies are focusing on and where the greatest needs exist, we see a particular gap in the area of skills development, which we are considering broadly as both workforce training programs and secondary education directed towards building professional skills. And there may be a space for USAID to increase its impact in this area, particularly in the low-income countries with the weakest outcomes and policies, where it currently works, but not exclusively. And it can do so without the need to disengage from other focus areas in its education strategy. In the paper, we set up the argument by going through the basic considerations, both in terms of current conditions and funding flows. So, for example, although there are very significant gaps in coverage at the pre-primary and tertiary levels, and significant challenges to improving educational quality at the primary and secondary level, both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank already dedicate a significant amount of their funding to these particular challenges. The area of workforce development is, however, a significant need that is currently receiving very little funding from traditional development actors, in particular in the countries where USAID works. Central American and Caribbean countries are facing huge economic and social pressures to figure out how to increase the relevance of their educational systems so that students graduate with the skills that employers demand, as well as productive ways to integrate their youth populations into the workforce. These countries have the highest rates in the region of youth who are not in education, employment, or training, yet this particular subsector receives some of the lowest levels of funding allocations from other development actors in the region. We see that the education that students do receive does not align with the skills that employers demand, and this lack of adequate skills development feeds into a vicious cycle, since it is exactly these youth who are then at risk for recruitment into gangs and most likely to be victims and often perpetrators of violent crimes. So there are two key aspects relating to leverage and engagement when focusing on workforce development. The first requires USAID to begin thinking of itself as not only transferring resources to implement projects, but also facilitating the engagement of other actors, both public and private. In the government, initiatives such as 100,000 Strong in the Americas and programs such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the Peace Corps are all potential partners. Outside of the government, community colleges, education nonprofits, and other academic institutions also share similar interests. As we see it, there are more opportunities for this particular type of engagement in workforce development than in other focus areas, such as early childhood development or primary education. And our panel discussions today will allow us to sort of test this hypothesis and probe more deeply what these partnerships might look like. Now, the second element relates to the fact that workforce development seems to be a challenge that cuts across the entire continent, much more so than the other two goals in USAID's current education strategy, early grade reading and education in crisis and conflict situations. So by deepening USAID's investment in workforce development, it's also broadening the number of countries that it can potentially engage with. Now, initially, USAID may not want to expand its geographical focus given its limited resources and the desire to not spread itself too thin. What we believe, however, will happen is that as USAID works more in countries with strong policy environments and stronger education outcomes, that is to say, at the other end of the typology, operating conditions are improved, and the agency is likely to find it less costly to work in a country with weak policy outcomes and a weak policy environment than one where those are stronger. And this is particularly true if it sees its role as being not only one of resource transfer, but also as a promoter of partnerships between institutions and actors in the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, the second part of this event is dedicated in large part to a discussion of just what those partnerships could look like and how USAID and other actors could both benefit from this shift. Now, we do want to recognize that what we are proposing does present a challenge for the current business model, which, with just a few exceptions, focuses on limited engagement. In other words, USAID chooses to work with implementing partners, which are often development practitioners or local NGOs, in order to administer their projects. And this model allows USAID to bypass government institutions, especially when they may be inefficient or corrupt, which is often most likely in those weak countries with weak outcomes and weak policies. And it also allows USAID to have a greater level of control over what gets done, even if it's not directly implementing the project. At the same time, however, this model limits USAID's ability to build capacity, certainly within governments, but also more generally in the country, since investments tend to be circumscribed directly to the organizations involved. So therefore, our proposal requires shifting towards a greater degree of institutional strengthening. We do recognize that this does imply greater risks, given that there's the potential to have less control over every single aspect of a project. The current model, however, is harder to sustain if there is to be an expanded focus on workforce development, an area which requires USAID to engage in a more systematic way with government institutions and policies in the way that many multilateral organizations do on a regular basis. Limited engagement is also a very difficult model to follow if USAID is to increase its role as a facilitator, given that this requires engaging with and building relationships between government institutions. By increasing its focus on workforce development, however, we believe that USAID can better leverage its role as a key U.S. government actor, that it can have a greater impact in the region, and that it can position itself in a more strategic way, given ongoing U.S. foreign policy goals. Thank you. I'm going to take this off.
I'll see it in the middle, so well, the good news is we're running ahead of time, ahead of schedule, so that gives us even more time for the discussion. Just to repeat some of the key messages to launch the discussion. The report basically puts forward, I would say, three main messages here. The first one is that if we think in terms of areas of opportunities for collaboration in the field of education between the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean, what we are calling skills development or workforce development seems to be an area of growth. And there we're including all the way from secondary education to higher education and training programs. That's message number one. Message number two is that if thinking about USAID, that there is a changing role, potential changing role from being a sort of agency that provides support for specific programs to becoming, in addition, more of a platform through which other actors in the United States can engage in a productive way in the education field in Latin America. And the third message that is sort of comes together with the other two is that there may be both opportunities and need for changing the business model. And this has to do with at least two things. One is the range of countries in which it works, and two, the way in which it engages with local partners, including with government. That's, the overall, long elevator pitch. And so we have a really wonderful panel to discuss this with people that are actually engaged in trying to make these things happen. And so they know they can complement a lot our own views and experience. So we have here Susan Bell, who is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere at the State Department. And among many other things, they run the 100,000 strong program for the Americas. Heather Ward is the Associate Director at the Center for Internationalization and Global Engagement at the American Council on Education. Nicole Johnson is the Head of Program Development, Private Sector and Government at the Institute of International Education. And among many other things, they also run the Fulbright program. And last but certainly not least, Michael Leisman, who is now the Acting Education Team Leader for Latin America at USAID, and has been really a close partner in this whole project. So let me start with Michael. Okay, and to start off, Michael, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why USA decided to support this study, and what you see as its use for the agency going forward. It is?
Yeah. Hello? Yeah. Thanks, Ariel. Great to be on this panel. Great to be here, back at the dialogue. And great to see everybody today having this discussion. It's not often that we can convene so many people in a room in Washington, D.C. to talk about education in Latin America. USAID has supported the dialogue and its development of an independent technical perspective on education trends in the LAC region, and an examination of where USAID and other donors should be focusing education funding in the future. And as was said before, the timing of this report is important and truly timely, given that USAID is currently leading development of a USG interagency education strategy, as well as a new USAID-specific education strategy, both scheduled to be publicly released later this year. In addition, USAID is strengthening its focus and commitment to helping countries move to self-reliance and ultimately eliminating the need for development assistance. So the concept of aid effectiveness is also truly timely. In recent years as well, USAID has phased out of education programming in several countries of the region. USAID currently has education programming from the traditional basic education and higher education funding accounts today active in 7 countries of the region, as the report notes. As USAID continues to transition out of education programming in many countries and in South America entirely, this is an important inflection point to consider the technical grounds for where USAID focuses its resources to have the greatest possible impact, as Sarah put the challenge. It's also an important moment to consider the broad landscape of where other donors are investing and the comparative advantages of USAID and other USG agencies and partners, such as the State Department, MCC, USDA, and the Department of Education. And that's why this report and the evidence-based informed discussion that it's engendering are so valuable to us. And I think that's sort of the context from which we were interested in supporting this report. And I think this has given us a lot to chew on and to consider as we enter this next phase of strategic decision making.
Let me press a little bit further and focusing on one of the key themes, the idea that skills development, workforce development, and the USA jargon offers growing opportunities for collaboration. And recognizing that it is one of the three strategic areas in the current strategy, what do you think USAID could be doing more of or different in this area in the LAC region? Hopefully our report perhaps already sparked some ideas, but beyond that, I suspect that you guys are constantly thinking about this question of what we could do doing differently that would create more impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the second goal of USAID's education strategy lays out the plans to improve the ability of tertiary and workforce development programs to generate workforce skills relevant to a country's development. And I do think that the wording of this is important because it emphasizes the importance of institutional and capacity building in beneficiary countries to provide the kinds of skills and training for their own countries. For many years, and I think it's important to note, through the very popular and successful SEED regional program managed by Georgetown University, USAID's LAC Bureau supported students from disadvantaged backgrounds across the LAC region to come to study at U.S. community colleges in priority skill sectors determined by host countries. And when this program came to a close several years ago, independent assessments demonstrated a few important relevant trends. First, that an extensive cadre of new post-secondary and tertiary institutions had developed over the past 20 years across the region, albeit of varying quality. Second, that it was incumbent on development assistance to help these institutions be able to prepare the 21st century workforce that their own countries needed. And that's the premise behind the USAID-supported advanced program implemented by FHI 360, which works collaboratively with select training institutions in several countries of the LAC region. The idea here, and I think this is part and parcel of what's innovative about the program, what we need to do more of moving forward is careful analysis of national labor force and academic offerings. Through that, the program works to improve and align post-secondary training with the formal sector jobs and careers necessary for economic development. And the same can be said for investments that USAID has made in a generation, a program, a project in Mexico as well as other countries in the region, led by the McKinsey Social Initiative with funding by the USAID Development Lab. That project merges smart technology with research on labor markets and behavioral economics and has the aim of fast-tracking motivated youth into high-demand technical career paths, including coding, retail, financial services. And looking at the future, as the report points out, USAID must continue to design programs not only with the host country governments in mind, but with inputs and concrete commitments from the private sector. I think that also means being very purposeful about target beneficiaries, and it means being practical in the types of outcomes expected and analytical in the ways that we track them. And this has implications for program design, tailored to meet different youth populations where they're at, and for post-program analyses and follow-up support. So also, as the report points out, attention to the workforce and employability of youth in Central America who are neither studying nor working is of particular concern to USAID. But providing support to the NEEs, the so-called NEEs, that creates real and immediate opportunities but does not overlook the prospect of a career path is one of the key challenges that we're looking at.
Good. I'm sure that they will come back to many of these things, and I think a general theme that is starting to come up is that there's a lot that meets the eye that is already happening, but somehow I suspect that not all of this occurs at a scale that is commensurate with the needs and the opportunities, and that a lot of this operates a little bit under the radar screen so that not all the other potential partners are fully aware of and engaged. Let me invite now Susan to tell us a little bit more about 100,000 Strong. As I suspect most of you, the audience, know, this is a program that was established during the Obama administration to promote the exchange of students. The goal was to have by 2020 100,000 students from Latin America studying in the U.S. and 100,000 students from the U.S. studying in Latin America. So I'm wondering, Susan, at this point, 2018, what have been the results so far? What are the lessons on particularly the bottlenecks that you have observed that perhaps can give us hints as to if we want to think of a broader strategy for the U.S. In this area, where are the bottlenecks that will need to be addressed if we really want to go for impact?
Well, do I have this on? Yes? Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, buenos dias, bon dia. I don't know if we have bonjour here or not, maybe not, but anyway, a pleasure, Ariel and Sarah. Really, congratulations on a really great report. USAID, thank you for supporting this. For those of us who have been in education diplomacy, really in the field for some time now, it really has given some academic validity to what we've been seeing, and I'll address that in just a minute. But first, I do want to acknowledge Maggie Hug and Melissa Galladay, who are here, who are really in the trenches day in and day out for the 100,000 strong in the Americas Innovation Fund efforts, and then also, of course, to all of our colleagues and partners from the respective embassies, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, I think Argentina is here, and of course the other great partner for 100,000 strong, represented here by Susana, NAFSA. And so it really has been a tremendous effort, but I do want to take one step back for a moment. And later, of course, you will have our biggest champion, perhaps, of education as a strategic engagement point, Ambassador Jacobson. But my comments that I'm going to offer you today, I want to caveat with the fact that I'm offering them as a Foreign Service officer, public diplomacy practitioner, education diplomacy in the field perspective. It's really in the practitioner vein that I'm going to offer my thoughts today, and from the wealth of experience in this particular region. In my 25-year career, I have spent all but 3 focused in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's really a pleasure to join this panel, especially with Nicole, Heather, Michael, Ariel, because in particularly, this isn't the first time we've met each other. So it's really great to see you all. And again, thank you for bringing us together. So to step back real quick, and then I'll get to the 100,000 strong list, which is what you're actually interested in sharing. But I don't want anyone to think that this is the only thing. There is education diplomacy that is happening in each of our embassies throughout the region, and our counterpart diplomatic corps here knows this very well because they're in the trenches with us every day, talking about how we, with the respective region or country and the United States, are really engaging on really education as a strategic priority in the foreign policy space. And so a credit, I wanted to make sure that that was well known, and under that big umbrella of education diplomacy includes all of the things Anthony Colija, also really an area for consideration. Predates that when Chile first started reaching out to California on building education partnerships. And then you fast forward to, the last decade, and we've had tremendous initiatives, whether from Brazil or from Colombia, from Mexico. Forgive me, I neglected Mexico earlier. And then, of course, sort of a second wave coming through, both in terms of the other countries, whether in the Caribbean or Panama, establishing its city of knowledge. So again, I would say there might not be a shared vision of a strategic plan in a particular country, but I would say that what this hemisphere has in common is this shared vision that education really does have the power to transform its societies and to provide opportunity. And to borrow, I really liked the Congressman's point this morning about an infrastructure of opportunity. That was really well said, I think, and I think that's what education really does provide. So to 100,000 strong, I do want to say that I think the shared vision also has been a result of the years and years that we all collectively have invested in creating exchanges between these two societies. And this gets to one of the points that I think that we'll jump to ahead, and that's in your report, and that really is the United States model of collaboration between higher education, governments, private sector, NGOs, in other words, a lot of stakeholders around the concept of education in this way as a strategic priority, really is a model that did not exist very much outside of the United States. And so as a result of our exchanges and our conversations and all of our collective efforts, really we're seeing this growing, this comfort level, if you will, of engaging in this way with each other. So bottom line, there's fertile ground, and there are a lot of players, aligned interests, 100,000 strong. There's an interesting timeline on this. 2011, this is when it was actually conceived. Took a couple of years to actually be designed well before it was launched as the Innovation Fund in 2014. But I'm told, and I think we should ask Ambassador Jacobson later to confirm this, but it was actually a conversation between President Obama and then President Dilma Rousseff in April of 2011 that actually planted the idea for Science Without Borders. And so I make this point again, is that we're out there all together in our collective ways, really pushing on education and how it can transform and do things. And so it's this sort of collective concept of it, that has really, I think, really hit a new velocity. And I think that's what we need to think about as we go ahead. So fast forward to now, I will tell you proudly that the 100,000 Strong Innovation Fund, again, was originally described as a moving, academic mobility, moving 100,000 people in both directions, if you will. I think that was that was a grand vision. I think it absolutely shortchanged what we actually have created, and what we have actually created is much more than that. And it is really a trusted, facilitated, and or trusted, flexible mechanism for creating these strategic networks and partnerships on an institutional and network level. So yes, we have the grand benefit of having individuals interacting, which was the original concept. But what it has brought with it is really this really dynamic way of our countries engaging around key issues. And I think what we need to also point out is that the end goal, yes, the original concept was about moving people, but again, it's much more than that. And we have created partnership with the countries I've already mentioned, and some still to come, in which they are really attacking, basically yielding the power of higher education communities around common problems or challenges. For example, whether it's in the Northern Triangle of violence, whether it's in Colombia for peace building, whether it's in Brazil for STEM education, whether it's in Argentina for the energy sector, all around these lines, these higher education networks are really playing a key role in I guess for this panel it would be development, but I would say it's even beyond that. I think there's a lot. It also has significant foreign policy and commercial spinoffs and results. So reporting to date, we have over, if I've got the statistic right, Maggie, and Melissa, you guys can tell me, since 2014, with over 20 grant competitions, we have over 300 teams or universities, if you will, executing 168 grants in 25 countries and 41 states. And this is one aspect that I think also gets short shrift, and that is the impact on the U.S. side of the equation. And I think that, what we've seen is really this interest in the U.S. higher education community as it looks to internationalize, especially more and more in this region. So I think that that's something worth noting as well. So maybe to close this point, I would just and then we can do a bit more on the lessons learned list. And I promise that's a much faster list. But that is, education diplomacy really is in the State Department's DNA. All of our embassies, our ambassadors are the champions in this regard. Our teams there in the field, also our teams back here, in terms of public diplomacy and what we're doing with all of our colleagues, a lot of them in this room. Again, it's so nice to see friendly faces. We really are, we have institutionalized this, similar to, yes, Fulbright was established 70 years ago, hard to believe, still bears the name Fulbright. I think people nowadays didn't realize, oh yeah, that was a senator and that's where it came from and that was the original champion, but now we all champion it, right? And I said in a similar vein, that's where 100,000 Strong is. We're at this critical point where it really has a lot of champions and we're continuing to push forward on that. So I think I've covered all the points, so thank you. So sorry.
About lessons learned.
Thank you.
You have, are there any lessons learned on
Shorter list.
the bottlenecks that need to be addressed?
Sure. I will go very quickly because I know I'm taking a bit more time than perhaps was allotted. I think the bottlenecks, I'm just going to go down my list very quickly, and if we want to discuss it, you can let me know. I think the original bottlenecks had everything to do, and I've sort of touched on them a little bit, is that it was just a program that was just a scholarship program. And I think that was, again, that was an original, there was a socialization issue that we needed to have. The second thing is this culture of collaboration among, the different entities, the stakeholders that we've already talked about. That's out of most institutions, especially governments, comfort zones sometimes. And so this U.S. model of private sector and university collaboration is what we felt like we were overcoming in the region. English, an obvious bottleneck, or language, if you will, in general. Funding movement. I would say this is a very key thing, not just for 100,000 Strong, but in a lot of our education diplomacy efforts. The process of just moving the money around programs, believe it or not. And that is like certain agencies have certain rules of moving money. Certain businesses can only do things a certain way. And so what this does is it really creates a lot of just very practical obstacles to trying to get something done quickly. And I think that is, again, 100,000 Strong has this very nimble, flexible, and I would say, as a lot of public diplomacy programs do, way of getting it done quickly. And so that's something to mention. And then I'd say the concept of higher education is also evolving in the region. Again, this difference between higher education being sort of an academic elite right versus, say, the more apprenticeship, the apprentice like workforce development. And I think what we're seeing indeed is a tremendous increased interest in tertiary education. You mentioned community colleges and technical. Absolutely. In just about every conversation now, and we've had a lot of 100,000 Strong grant rounds with community colleges and technical, as well as on that side. And that's not the higher education, but it's the Sinais and the Sinakis and the SESIs and these groups are tremendously looking at this as well. I would say maybe as a last two points, I promise. The market forces of where things going. This is something, at first it was a very open, 100,000 Strong, very open. And if we wanted to, you could almost, I think with every round we've had excess demand. We've had much more interest. And so we had to work on the quality of proposals, like how to actually, court the partnership a little bit and socialize. So there were a lot of workshops in which we did this. And then our teams in the field are also continuing to do this. So market forces of who would get the grant rounds. If we left it alone, it would probably go to Mexico, right? Maybe Brazil, maybe Argentina in that order. But what we found was that is not where our needs or where in terms of our partnerships with our, where we wanted them to go. So we really had to think about how do we build the capacity on even coming up with a proposal. And so that was something that was very key, and that's something that we've all collectively worked at NAFSA, between NAFSA, Partners of the Americas, and the embassies have done relentlessly. And then last but not least, and this is a very important, I think, last point, and that is the idea that it's private-public means that it's private-public. And what I mean by that is that the governments have to keep skin in the game. And what I mean by that also gets back to where the interests lie and where we want to be. A lot of people think that when you create a public-private, your end goal is really to have the private sector take it over in the end so that public doesn't have to give resources. And from this experience, I will tell you that it has actually been the governments, both U.S. and the counterpart governments, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, tremendously. Once the money is on the table, it's a bit of an insurance, both in terms of avoiding the corruption issues in the region, but also it brings and convenes the other partners to the table more often than not. And so I maybe just leave with that last point. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks, and clearly lots of interesting issues coming up that will require a lot more time that we have to discuss. But let me just pick on two issues that I think are interesting. One is this idea you put forward that the notion or the model of having multi-stakeholder collaboration that is a lot more natural to the U.S. or the U.S. higher education sector doesn't come as naturally to countries in the region. In a way, you could put it also as an opportunity, in the sense that where the real opportunity of a program like this lies is not so much on the quantitative deliverables, but moreover on the transfer or the promotion of a different model of running the education system. So perhaps this is something that we can come back to later in the discussion. The second point, it's interesting to us, you mentioned English being a barrier. The dialogue released last September a report we did on the state of English language learning in Latin America, and which I invite everyone to look at. But one of the important messages that we have in the report is that while at the K-12 level, ministries of education now have, there are, to a great extent, most countries have a policy framework and strategies. When it comes to the post-secondary higher education level, there is no national framework, no policy, no goals, no standards, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a huge vacuum in that area.
Institutional. It's more institutional.
It's each institution does whatever they want. Anyway, just thought that was useful to mention. Let me now move on to Nicole. And the Institute of International Education engages through a range of programs with governments, business in the various countries of the region. And perhaps you can give us, it would be useful to give us a quick rundown as to what you do, because I suspect that not everyone is fully familiar. But particular, I think the question here is, what is the demand? Where is the demand for collaboration and engagement with U.S. institutions? Where do you see the areas and the actors in Latin America and the Caribbean that are really interested and demand potentially partnerships and collaboration? Okay,
so the quick answer on that is, in the past 15 years that I've been working in the region, it is shifted significantly, probably every 3 to 5 years, that demand. But I'll go back to that. Let me start with an introduction. First of all, congratulations, Ariel and Sarah, on a phenomenal report. I really feel beneficial that I got it in advance and could read through it. For those of you that can grab a copy on your way out, I hope you brought a highlighter. Find a quiet corner on your way home and go through it and really read through it, because it's really outstanding. You've drawn some important research points from that and conclusions that I think can really help shape our thinking around where to drive innovation in supporting educational development in the area. So IIE, Institute of International Education, you mentioned Fulbright. That is the flagship program that we've been working with the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of the State Department since the inception of the program. We also work with the Gilman International Scholarship Program, which brings U.S. students to study abroad, including in Latin America, and work with Anthony Collia and his team on that project, as well as another number of State Department funded programs. IIE's work is really, we're going to turn 100 next year, which is kind of shocking, but we're really excited about that. And we've been physically located in the Americas for 44 years with an office in Mexico City. So our work is divided into three main areas. One is advancing scholarship, and we design and implement many of the world's most prestigious scholarship programs, such as Fulbright and Gilman and Humphrey. And we're involving our sponsors in real creative programming around those programs. So changing and revising and modifying these, modernizing these programs as we go. I'll mention, I think it was Sarah that mentioned that we also do some data capture on international student mobility. And so every year IIE produces the Open Doors reports with sponsorship from the Department of State, Anthony's office as well. And last year's data showed that we have around 80,000 students and scholars from the Americas going to the US for anywhere from short-term to full degree programs. And then, 80,000 students and 9,500 scholars, which I think is a really important distinction there. So these are academics doing research or teaching or working in doing scholarly work in U.S. institutions. And then we also have 53 U.S. students doing study abroad in the Americas in the previous academic year. It's based on academic credit earned. We also, in order to advance scholarship, is working with international academic partnership programs, so helping U.S. universities create those connections with universities around the world and understanding how to really form substantive and sustainable partnerships with universities in specific areas. So we conduct the training and workshops, but then we also lead delegations of U.S. universities to the region. So we've done that in Cuba, in Colombia, in Mexico, and several delegations to Brazil, which is a really important partner in a lot of our work. The second area of our work is around building economies. So we work with governments to develop their education for an educated workforce, and really aimed at supporting their participation in the global economy. So one important program that Susan mentioned is the Brazil Scientific Mobility Program. We worked really closely with the whole team at the embassy and very closely with the Fulbright Commission in Brazil on that project. I should mention, related to Fulbright, that we work with the Fulbright commissions and the embassies and consulates in each of those countries quite closely. And Susan, your team out in the field has been phenomenal in really moving that forward. We also work with companies. So you mentioned some of the companies, which I think is sometimes the biggest question that I have heard from those engaged in international ed is, where are they? And where is the funding coming from, and how are they engaged? So we're working with some corporations and corporate foundations to really move that forward. I commend you and Maggie and Partners of the Americas on all the work getting that innovation fund and the power that you've had in galvanizing funding and moving that forward with the partnerships. It's really phenomenal to have that moving forward. So our work with companies is really to maximize their corporate social responsibility and social impact investment in the countries where they do business. And honestly, that fluctuates. So we're managing a program with the Arconic Foundation, which is the corporate foundation for a large manufacturing entity. And Brazil was one of the countries, but they recently pulled out of that. And now most of the countries are in Eastern Europe. But it's a really great model, which I can talk on a little bit later, that's around internships for workforce development for students that have either graduated from higher ed or maybe they didn't, and providing that sort of training with them. So finally, the third area of our work is promoting access to opportunity. So working with people that have had disadvantaged backgrounds or lack of access to education, for example, empowering women and girls. We worked on a project with UNESCO through the UN mission to work with teachers and educators in Costa Rica and Panama on helping them encourage girls in STEM education. So it's a really, there are a lot of different models out there of how you can work with education. I would say, just to touch on a couple of the other programs that we work on that I can draw upon a little bit later, we have a program with the Seattle International Foundation, which is sort of a donor-advised fund out of Seattle through the Seattle Foundation, and they focus on the Central America, in particular the Northern Triangle, and we work with community-based organization leaders. So these are civil society organizations, but our role is training them. So think of it as there are a lot of advocates and those engaged in their work that they're passionate about, but perhaps didn't have a lot of the background and preparation on how to run an international organization or a local NGO, or even connect with other entities in the country that are engaged in that. And so our work is providing them with training on financial management, how to network among the different groups across the region. So we're seeing a lot more collaboration in that way. And they're really important partners. I think it's a model that USAID definitely follows of engaging local partners, and one that we're really helping to build capacity on. I also, another program that's quite interesting is we're doing a work with the MacArthur Foundation on midwifery education in Mexico. So advancing the field as a profession, and also the schools that are offering, both the kind of formal schools and informal schools that are offering those programs, and really aimed at professionalizing the education and the field. So I will stop there.
And just to press you, because I'm pressing everyone, come back to the million-dollar question as to if you look at these issues from the point of view of actors in Latin America and the Caribbean, how much demand is there for collaboration, cooperation, partnerships with U.S. institutions? Do you see any patterns? Just to give an example, we all talk about STEM as an area that needs to grow in Latin America. Is that where the demand is? Can you give us a little bit of an impression? I know you may not have hard data, but where's the demand?
So 15 years ago, when I was working with Education USA in Mexico City, advising students that wanted to study in the U.S., I was always shocked when they would come in and they said, I studied mercadotecnia, or that's what I want to study. And I started to see it everywhere. And I thought, they've got to have a lot of people that can do marketing in Mexico and in Latin America. And I just saw this sort of disconnect between what students wanted to study and where there was what the labor market need was. And based on your report, I can see that trend probably is continuing. So there's this, and that's where I think that there's this opportunity with the private sector, with the companies, to not just fund and support that training, but have a real dialogue with the universities and the ministries around what those key, where the economy is growing and what those needs are. That's from the student perspective. From the university perspective, from the Americas, what I have heard from universities is, again, 15 years ago, it was, well, we want some American students to come in, and how do we attract them? And so talking about programs, that was before Gilman, but talking about some of those opportunities for increasing study abroad. And this is where I think the work that ECA is doing and having that study abroad office is really pushing that message and getting the resources to the U.S. institutions on how to increase study abroad. And now the shift that I'm seeing, and I wouldn't say it's in every single country in LAC, but is that the universities are saying, let's take this concept of student mobility a step further and really try to strengthen a level of collaboration beyond student mobility, beyond scholar mobility to research. And they're being supported in that message or even pushed in that message from their ministries of education. So Colombia has Colombia Científica that is really driving that message home to the universities and saying, this is important, develop a partnership around research. You see it in Brazil. Brazil has just recently, I think it was in October, launched the idea that the universities have to come up with their plan for internationalization or print and draft out what their plan is to engage. I mean, this is coming from, I think it's CAPES, to say this is important and we're going to look at what you're doing and potentially fund it. And so this is sort of, it's looking at partnership as a component or driver of comprehensive internationalization.
Thank you. And just to notice that some of the same countries are being mentioned repeatedly. There seems to be a pattern here, which, by the way, coming back to the regional discussion on USAID, happen not to be the countries, most of the countries in which USAID is actively engaged. So there is, I don't know what's the answer to this, but I think there is a pattern that is coming up quite strongly.
Ariel, sorry, just to clarify, they are engaged in the countries, but with different priorities, not in the education. And I think, especially like Brazil and
From
Colombia.
an education point of view.
Yeah.
Good, yeah, fair point. Heather, American Council on Education. You tell us a little bit more so that we're all on the same wavelength, but the way I would put it is the way you are representing the supply side in this equation, right? You are an organization that represents U.S. colleges and universities. And so it would be interesting to hear a little bit about what you guys are doing in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in particular, how do you see the American universities and colleges prepared and interested to really engage in a more systematic way, in a more ambitious way, in the education sector or in education sector partnerships in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ariel. And also Sarah for the invitation to be with everyone today. I think that you provided a nice description about the fact that so-called hard development doesn't always include a focused conversation about education, but I can't think of any other engine of social and economic mobility that could be more powerful for the transformation of the countries in which all of you work. And so I'm just really pleased to be invited today. And I will try to speak from the perspective of U.S. higher education. It is a really large sector of our society, so I'm one voice, but I'll try to represent the work that ACE does. And I will say that in general, our U.S. colleges and universities are very interested in engaging internationally, more so now than ever before. We recognize that U.S. higher education, like higher education in all countries, now operates in a global ecosystem. Our scholars are more engaged with one another in terms of their research and publication in science and technology. Our students are very mobile, going back and forth between countries. Ideas and knowledge and communications are more mobile than ever. And so it is no longer the case that you can talk purely about an American higher education institution without taking into account all of its many tentacles that reach out into the world. And our research confirms this. So at ACE, we represent about 1,800 U.S. institutions of all different types and sizes, private and public, community colleges, 2-year, 4-year institutions. And that kind of stands us apart from some of the other higher education associations that represent, let's say, just community colleges. And so we advocate on behalf of U.S. higher education in terms of federal policy. We try to develop the leadership of those institutions, and increasingly we try to find ways for them to engage with their counterpart institutions around the world or with higher education associations in other parts of the world. And we do a study every 5 years called Mapping Internationalization on U.S. Campuses. And the latest iteration of the report was was published in 2017. And we found that international partnership activity, by and large, is increasing and becoming a higher priority at most institutions. In fact, the majority of U.S. institutions. 40% have a formal articulated strategy for becoming more globally engaged. We also asked about geographic focus of that partnership activity, and we see that existing activity is largely focused in the UK, China, and a few other countries. But looking forward, Brazil and Mexico were named as two out of the 6 highest priority countries for further engagement. I will talk too about challenges and bottlenecks. So I would say that we have a lot of wonderful efforts to encourage more mobility, more connection, students studying in the other country, and we don't want to discount that or stop it or undermine it. I wish that we had millions strong in the Americas. It was certainly figured into my own background and why I'm, doing this work today. There can be no more transformative experience, but the reality is that very few students have that opportunity in the United States. Among students who obtain a 4-year degree, and that's already, we're talking about less than half of the US population, only 1 in 10 of those will participate in education abroad. Now, that's people who get a 4-year degree. If we look only at community colleges, half of American students are enrolled today at community colleges. 1.7% of them will participate in education abroad. So I think it's very exciting that you're seeing through the 100,000 Strong initiative that there are other types of engagement and that your efforts aren't purely around the movement of students, but that you're establishing a network of deeper engagement among students and our education institutions. So in addition to mobility, we really try to emphasize the role of faculty, because often these relationships are built on the personal relationships that faculty have across our countries. They don't leave the institution. They'll stay for a long time, especially if tenure is in the picture. They will infuse their curriculum with their experience or with their knowledge of the other country. And that also lends itself, of course, towards deeper research. We see quite a number of joint and dual degree programs between U.S. Institutions and institutions in the Latin America, Caribbean region. And we also see an increasing use of virtual exchange for helping students and faculty connect. We're currently doing a virtual exchange project funded by the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo to connect U.S. and Japanese higher education institutions. The SUNY Center for Collaborative Online International Learning had a very significant initiative with Mexico to connect students in New York and Mexico virtually. So I would say an outsized emphasis historically on mobility has been one of the bottlenecks. And then another one would be the limited involvement of a number of institutions and the type of institutions in the U.S. We have 4,000 some odd U.S. post-secondary institutions in this country. Not all of them are engaged in Latin America, but there's tremendous interest and they could be more engaged. I think it's great that the ECA, your efforts are focusing specifically on community colleges and some minority serving institutions for investment. And we know that that's working because in our mapping internationalization study, we found that minority serving institutions reported a higher level of internationalization and a higher level engagement with international peers, and they were receiving more federal funding for that activity. So we know that your investments are paying off, and it would be great to spread it around among more of the institutions that are not already highly engaged. So I said that most institutions reported they're having more partnership activity. It's more of a focus of what they want to do. But 44% of community colleges reported they have 0 international partnerships. That's a tremendous opportunity, and especially if we're focusing on workforce development and alignment of skills, our community colleges are a tremendous resource for further engagement in the region. And then I'll just reference one other piece of research that might be of interest to this group, and that's a study that we did last year on U.S.-Mexico engagement, in which we cataloged all the many different types of agreements that are currently out there in existence in the forms of MOUs or student mobility agreements, and then analyzed what's going on. And we saw that there's a lot of concentration of activity at the border, And again, that the same institutions tend to be involved in multiple ways. So we really feel like there's an opportunity to reach more deeply into the interior of the United States and into other parts of the Latin America region for those types of partnerships.
Very good. And actually, I think many of your comments reinforce what we mentioned earlier, the need to disaggregate and to look at the heterogeneity of actors. So before I mentioned in terms of countries, here you're talking about types of institutions and within the U.S. regionally. In a way, what I believe we all want to avoid is this collaboration to become just an elite type of collaboration between a few star institutions in Latin America and a few internationally oriented institutions in the U.S. And that makes the effort a lot more complex. You've been really good in terms of keeping time, so we still have a few minutes before the next panel, and so I really want to push hard on the one of our arguments in the paper, which is that USAID can do more by being more than just a development agency with its own programs, but also engaging with others, including your organizations, to become a platform for engagement in education in Latin America. And so I would like to give each of you, I'll leave you until the end. I would like to give a few minutes to each of you to put forward an idea or two that you believe could be useful, things that could be done differently on the part of AID to further empower the good work that you're already doing it. And then we'll let Michael have a final word as a reaction to what he heard. Heather, you want to start it?
Great, thank you. I've heard a lot of conversation today about the idea of it involving multiple stakeholders in initiatives that are development-oriented, including higher education institutions. I think that's a great idea. And I want to reference a program that existed from 1992 to 2014, Higher Education for Development, HED. It was a joint initiative between USAID and the American Council on Education, and it was specifically created to form and manage partnerships between U.S. and developing country higher education institutions to work in collaboration toward a shared development objective. And over the course of that period, HED supported 370-something partnerships worldwide in about 60 countries, and many of them in Latin America, and some of them were consortial. So, for example, there was one focused on Andean Amazon conservation that involved institutions in Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, with 4 U.S. universities, and it involved research, but specifically with the goal of improving conservation in the region. And by the way, there was capacity building in the Latin American region as a byproduct or as a part of the goal. Sometimes that capacity building was implicit or explicit in the grant, and sometimes it occurred through the course of this collaboration because it meant having to manage a significant grant funding, achieve the deliverables and goals of the project. And many of these partnerships live on today without the funding. So the funding got them going, and they still exist. HED no longer exists, but that's the kind of role I think that USAID could play, is in this platformer, and it would help reach, you said, the disaggregation of the actors involved. It could help reach the less involved institutions that may not have the capacity to apply for and manage a large contract.
Thank you. So we've been, our idea was not new. It has been already implemented in the past. Good to hear that. Nicole.
So a couple ideas come to mind. First of all, I have to admit we don't currently work on any USAID projects in Latin America. Most of our work with aid has been in Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. So one program model that we're currently working in is in Indonesia, Sustainable Higher Education Research Alliances. And to Heather's point about working with multiple stakeholders, this is one that also involves the ministry. And the idea here is that we work with the kind of top performing universities in Indonesia. And they're the ones, and along with the ministry, to say, these are the key areas of development for us going forward. These are the areas where we need to strengthen our research and their, issues of relevance to the country. They link up with a U.S. university partner, and then they also work with several Indonesian universities to that are not as high performing. So it's building their capacity as well. The trick here is that it's all locally driven. It's all based on what's needed in country. And then it's also, the grants are directly to the Indonesian universities, not through the U.S. institutions. And so the subrecipient monitoring component of that is actually a lot of work in and of itself, because we're building that capacity to manage those grants. And I think that one is a really good model for building that capacity. I know in Colombia, the Columbia Científica model is a slight variation of that, but that's at the higher education research level. The other one that I meant to mention, which I mentioned before, is the Arconic Foundation model, which is workforce development through internships. So, and the foundation is interested in advancing their work with and building a talent pipeline for people from all over the world for manufacturing jobs. So they're giving the opportunity for these students to have an internship at a local manufacturing company, which is important to the relationship for those local manufacturing companies with Arconic, which are their partner entities. And so you're building off of some of these business relationships that are quite binational in nature. With the BSMP program that we managed, we had, for example, students going into we had 22,000 students in the U.S. 15,000 of those did internships after a short-term academic program. One group of students went to Boeing, and Boeing was interested in this because they have a plant back in Brazil, and so they're also building a talent pipeline there.
By the way, we also see quite a bit of interest from part of the business community in Latin America on apprenticeships and dual education programs more generally. We had an interesting panel not too long ago with a delegation from Brazil that came, and there was quite a bit of interest between the U.S. and Brazil on this issue. Your chance to make a pitch.
No, it's building. I have two thoughts that come to mind. One is, in reading and thinking, if indeed USAID is going to enter this space differently, or think about a paradigm shift, I think it's very important to consider some of the organizational culture and practice, which does not provide flexibility sometimes in the field to react quickly. And I don't, and here's why. I'm going to come up with two things. In the one place where it's worked well, it's not a higher education example, but I remember in the field we piloted a project, the Martin Luther King Fellows Program in Colombia, that was focused on Afro-Colombian and indigenous youth for English and leadership. And the country, the mission there liked it very much, and they said, this aligns with what we're doing in terms of vulnerable communities and building peace, et cetera. And so we struck a deal where they would support the programs in the respective regional areas where we wouldn't, and then we kept doing the both. So it was a really great collaboration. On the flip side, I remember, and this I promise I won't go into detail, but promoting the diversity of either historically Black colleges and universities, minority institutions, and of course, and land-grant universities in particular. We had several very, great initiatives with, the wealth of, we had 9 land-grant universities and the big ones in Colombia ready to partner and engage, and they've again, done it, both through 100,000 Strong and other initiatives, Fulbright, the whole combination of the education diplomacy team, if you will. And it was met a little bit with, sort of with the hand, oh, you're coming here for money. And it's like, no, that's not, we want this to help, expand. So there's a little bit of some organizational culture that I think together we need to think about, if indeed, and then my final thought is, I actually like the idea of where, not to go against the research or the chart, but I think USAID is uniquely qualified in those areas and I'm thinking the Caribbean, I'm thinking the Northern Triangle, because I'm thinking if you go from there, yes, you have the organizations, but then from a foreign policy team approach, we miss a little bit of that being a player there and in that regard. So if it does shift at all, I want it to expand and not go away. You know what I mean? And I think that if it goes into the other areas, I think what we need to do is, if that's that middle column, if we're looking at or then we need to play it in more of that education diplomacy conversation and not as a USAID project. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
We started the conversation has started. Michael, any reactions? And then we'll take a few minutes just for a couple of questions from the floor.
I really appreciate the comments from the panel, and I'm in pretty much full agreement with most of them. The first reaction I have to the idea of USAID as a platform for collaboration, not just a source of funding, I think is an important one, and one that certainly our bureau has striven for over some time. And I think there are certain business models and operational standards that define that all U.S. agencies have to work with when it comes to procurement. So our hands are tied in that respect. But there has been a lot of innovation over the past 5-10 years, I would say, in ways to sort of not just engage in what Sarah and Ariel call limited engagement, but to really leverage the resources that the USG has in all of its agencies and the presence that we have in the countries. An example, and just one example, is the innovation of the broad agency announcement, which probably sounds like gobbledygook to most people, but it's an innovation in that rather than doing the standard, hey, here's a solicitation for a project or a program, let's bring actors together. And starting with the challenge, here's what we're dealing with. In Guatemala, for example, the issue was youth unemployment. And we really didn't go much further than that. Put together some evidence that suggested this was indeed a problem. So it was evidence-based. Brought together a really wide number of actors in Guatemala to essentially put together the solution. And that resulted in an agreement brought forth by the broad agency announcement. I think research collaboration is another issue that was brought up. It's super important and really is another way to leverage the vast amount of resources in the education system the U.S. has, merging with partners in Latin America. One of the challenges I was thinking about is that research in a lot of countries in Latin America, certainly the countries where USAID is engaged, is a challenge because the university systems, and I agree, Heather, with everything you said, you don't have the same emphasis on research in a lot of the university systems in Latin America. It's not the same publish or perish model that you have that effectuates tenure in the U.S. And so I think there's a fundamental gap there where the U.S. partners are often coming in as the heavies, and I think that doesn't necessarily engender the kinds of true research collaboration that we'd like to see, and doesn't necessarily address the gap that exists in research in Latin America, in education particularly, but also in other areas. And lastly, the issue of the private sector. Where are they? That's a nice title. That's a nice blog post or an article, I think. And it's a question we often have at USAID. It's not to say that we haven't been able to find them. It's not to say that they're not out there and interested. USAID and the LAC Bureau alone has had really meaningful MOUs with big tech companies, IBM, Google, Microsoft, and at the national levels, the USAID missions are working hand in hand with the American Chambers of Commerce, for example, or the National Council of Private businesses in each of these countries. So they're there, they're interested, they're working, but they have their own interests, and it's difficult to, I wouldn't say it's like herding cats, but it's difficult to get everybody together on the same page because it is a business. They do have business interests, and even the ones that want to work and have a sort of corporate social responsibility mindset still have to attend to their own complicated set of agendas.
Thanks, Michael. And while we set up for the next session, we have 8 minutes. So I will take a couple of questions. It have to be really brief. Let me start one from there. Can we?
What would you see as a priority for LAC? And I want to put a plug in for secondary school leavers and TVET graduates. And that would lead you more towards the USAID priority countries to begin with. If you then define workforce development for that cohort in particular, I want to put a plug in for looking at job placement and increasing job quality for those in workforce development programs, because what we find in Latin America and the Caribbean is you can slap the workforce development label on about anything as long as you say you've acquired some sort of skills or employability. And so I want to put a plug in for can we be tighter and more targeted on how we define workforce development.
Thank you. Let me see. Yes.
I work with the International Youth Foundation and actually just came back from closing out a USAID-funded workforce development project with to reform the TVET system in Mexico. And I wanted to actually highlight 2 areas in that USAID, I think, can serve as a fantastic platform around issues of quality and relevance through leveraging partnerships with the Department of Labor in the U.S. To access curriculum, actually, through community colleges that was developed with the TACT grant. We were able to incorporate into the standard curriculum 13 technical specialties into the standard TVET system for 7 of Mexico's highest productivity sectors. And for the case of aerospace and energy, we're able to work with USAID to access curriculum created through Department of Labor grant, which unfortunately we couldn't count as leverage because it's already U.S. government property, but it was like $40 million worth of curriculum that we were able to incorporate into the standard TVET. And it wasn't just like, hey guys, send me your curricular documents. The technical assistance that the community college professors were able to provide to help us work with our industry partners. So if you look at like the Boeing supply chain, it goes from Chihuahua, Mexico up through Seattle and Tacoma. So that was one thing. And then another area that I've really been inspired by is when I look at teacher quality. And so this quality issue, when we think about instructional leadership in Latin America, it's sometimes not even a concept that a lot of education administrators are familiar with. And I think there's been some really interesting work in Chile in partnership with UC Berkeley around instructional leadership particularly. And whenever I dig a little bit on really impressive teacher transformation organizations, they have this sort of hidden side thing that they don't tell anyone about, which is the instructional leadership side. And there's some really important work that U.S. universities are doing around that. So those are 2 areas.
Excellent. And anyone on this side? I'm just very conscious about equity. Anyone sitting here? No. Okay, so I'll give you a chance.
My name is Alfonso Victoria. I work for the Small Business Development Center, the Hispanic Business Center. We work with very vulnerable entrepreneurs. Hispanics are the highest growth, have the highest growth rate for opening businesses, but the lowest in scale them. So I'm developing a program and I'm trying to find a house for that program, which is called Emprendizaje. It's basically developing in Latin America the skills, the basic skills that are very related to entrepreneurship, but not necessarily focused on businesses. I think that entrepreneurship is very focused on the individual, and that kills the opportunity for entrepreneurship because people don't learn to work together. Also, strengths development, because people don't focus on finding what are they best at, and on soft skills. Finding opportunities and keeping those opportunities, whether that's a career, a job, or stuff like that. So my question is, where can I find a home for that program?
Any takers?
That to the right direction.
Thank you. We need to bring the session to closure because we have the panelists here, and we'll take a minute to set it up. But final words, I don't know whether you have, still have a microphone with you. Any reactions to what you heard?
The report cited the progression from secondary to technical and vocational was much lower than to higher education, if I understood Sarah's presentation correctly. And I agree, that's a tremendous opportunity. I think there's a stigma that goes with vocational and technical education that should be addressed. And maybe the collaboration with other institutions, community colleges, like the example cited over there, was very promising. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael.
I don't have a quick and dirty definition, but I think the report does provide some good background and context that I think we generally agree with as a priority for workforce development. I mean, there's a number of them. I do think that aligning the needs of the formal workforce with the offering of training is the big overarching one. On the teacher quality issue, USAID hardly agrees. This has been a central area for programming for a long time. Barbara Knox-Seif, my colleague in the audience here, actually managed something called the Centers of Excellence for Teacher Training for a long time set in the region. That was one of the premier regional networks of teacher training and instructional leadership. So something we take very seriously and consider it a priority. I don't have any suggestions for a home for entrepreneurship, but perhaps we could talk more, and I'd like to learn more about the project.
Susan. Yeah. Keep it short.
We'll talk about entrepreneurship. We actually have a lot. If there's 4 E's I would leave you with, we have education, English, entrepreneurship, and exchanges. Okay, 4 E's. That's what public diplomacy in this region does. So we'll talk about entrepreneurship. In terms of closing out on education diplomacy and 100,000 strong, and it does, we talked a lot about the academic side of it, but really the ultimate goal is to serve the private sectors. As when we craft these partnerships, it really is about workforce development. In terms of the measurements, right now we're at the stage where we can actually start. I think we're at that sort of a 4-year mark where where they've really been gaining steam and really crossing over into the community colleges and technical a bit more. And so I think we're at a good point to be able to go back to those involved. So I can't from that program. Nor is it really our role, but I think from a program management standpoint, we're planning to take a closer look. So thank you for that question. No, I think together it's just all of this effort is shaping the generations to come for the relationship in the hemisphere. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
A couple comments on the evaluation piece. We have a monitoring evaluation learning unit that, and in this particular program that I referenced, Arconic, they developed a framework specific to that program. I would want them to talk about it because I'm not an ME expert. But actually the full report is available on our website, so you can get that. I love the reference to teacher education. I would say it's teachers and educators and principals and all of those, the decision makers, and in terms of leadership, really helping them think about managing change, which is a challenge in many areas. And I would love to talk to you about the entrepreneurship program. I think that's really exciting. But just closing comments are, I think there are some really important models that don't have to be singled out as unique, but some sort of merger of those best practices, existing models in other parts of the world of USAID programs and others. And I think there are a lot of partners, and IIE is certainly committed to advancing that in the future.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists for really great contributions and remaining on time. We're only 11:01. It's a miracle. Honestly, we just touched the surface. I think what this quick discussion has demonstrated is that there is the potential, but also the need for a more consistent and systematic discussion, which we will be happy to continue hosting, on how to really bring various stakeholders around the table to better coordinate and to improve and expand the kind of programs that you've all mentioned, because the potential is there. So thank you very much, and I hope that this is going to be the first of many. With that, I think we need just a minute to rearrange the seats and have a final session.
Please take their seats. We're going to get started.
Wanda, qué gusto. Igualmente. And the kids who are not so little.
Very, growing up, at UVA.
Could everybody please take their seats? We're going to begin the final panel. Everybody can please sit down. Okay, great. Thank you very much. As Ariel mentioned earlier today, at the opening of the conference, we decided to have a final panel focus on the issues of education in Latin America and the Caribbean, and from a foreign policy perspective. Thought that would be extremely interesting to build on some of the very good discussions we had in presenting this report, and also hearing the perspectives of other stakeholders and those involved in cooperation in education between Latin America and the United States. The idea is how to maximize the impact of education cooperation in the region and explore the possibilities for shared engagement. I think it's not overstating it to say that we're at a challenging and uncertain moment in U.S.-Latin American relations. There are rocky times on issues like trade and immigration that tend to grab the headlines and dominate the policy debates. So in that context, with that background, the idea of this session is to consider how greater engagement and cooperation might help advance U.S. foreign policy goals of increasing U.S. markets for U.S. economic interests, and also broader aims to increase security, reduce violence, and to staunch the irregular migration within and from Latin America and the Caribbean. Is it possible to strengthen hemispheric relations through more constructive and effective engagement on the issues that we've been discussing today? And if so, how should we go about it? We're very, very privileged and honored to have two superb, distinguished, and respected panelists with us. They have vast experience and are very thoughtful on precisely this issue. And they're also both good friends and also members of the Inter-American Dialogue. One of them just accepted about 30 seconds ago, so we want to extend a warm welcome to Roberta. Roberta Jacobson needs no introduction, but she recently retired from a very distinguished career in the State Department of more than 30 years. Just was former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Mexico for 2 years under President Obama and then President Trump. Before that, she served as Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and she's had many other very high-level senior posts in Western Hemisphere Affairs over the years. She is very respected, beloved by many, including the Mexicans, who really praised her for her professionalism and integrity during challenging times in U.S.-Mexican relations. Roberta has a degree from Brown University and a graduate degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of Tufts University. And we're really so happy to have her with us today. She's a real trooper. So coming under these conditions, we're especially grateful. Miguel Castilla served as Peru's ambassador to the U.S. For several years. He was also Minister of Economy and Finance in Peru. He worked for CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, and he's now at the Inter-American Development Bank as a manager in the Office of Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness. He has a degree from McGill University and also master's and doctorate in economics from Johns Hopkins. So I think we couldn't ask for two better people to talk about this issue. Let me just start with Roberta, if I could, and just if you could just tell us what your sense of really the possibilities of cooperation in this field as a way to enhance U.S. foreign policy objectives. And I know you've thought a lot about this and you've been involved in a lot of programs, so perhaps you can get us started.
Thank you, Michael, and I really appreciate being here. I hope that my mic doesn't end up being like too close or too loud because it's way up high. I think one of the things that you'll see, and I'm particularly happy to be here with my very good friend and former partner in crime, you might say, Miguel Castilla, when he was ambassador and I was assistant secretary, and we worked very closely together and have for a number of years. And I think most importantly, perhaps, really see eye to eye on the importance of education, both in the relationship building part of our foreign policies in the hemisphere and on the impact it can have in the countries of the region for the future. But what you'll see today, I want to give you one caveat, is you'll see both my biases and my knowledge gaps. I'm not an education expert, unlike those who've written the study and thought about this alone for years. We have some from the State Department here today. And my biases, I think what you'll find is, having lived in Mexico for the last 2 years, most of my examples will end up being those in Mexico. Some of them are relevant for the rest of the hemisphere, some are not. So just a warning as we start. I think there's a couple things. First of all, the U.S. has been in the business of promoting education or educational exchanges for a very long time. Well before the term soft power existed, we thought that it was important to bring people to the United States for educational exchanges and to support people who were doing such exchanges abroad. That's why Fulbright exists, Fulbright Garcia Robles in Mexico, and other programs. What we've learned over more recent years, and I think the study presented today is one of the best examples, is just how important it is for so many of our foreign policy objectives that aren't obvious. And I think that the most important thing that we can underscore to policymakers is that we're not doing this because it's philanthropy or charity, that it is very, very much self-interested foreign policy to engage in education. And that does not mean that I don't love this and it's not my passion for, I think, some of the other reasons that education is important, whether it's girls' education or other areas. But I think that nowadays, when you have to justify every dollar and every program and budgets are being cut, when you can use that sort of hard-nosed, efficiency and the benefits that we in the United States, as well as the countries, will get for these investments, you hopefully have a better chance of getting what you need. When I was looking at the study, I think I agreed, most particularly in this day and age, that there are multiple entities that are involved in this, whether they're IFEs or individual governments, that it is best to focus the U.S. where we're value added, where we can do more, focusing, let's say, on poorest countries, focusing on countries that don't get the attention otherwise. Some of the panelists here talked about the way, and in general, the way we kept repeating the same countries, the way the same countries attract attention, whether they're because they're larger, because they've made more innovative or creative efforts at education. But to me, as we launched programs in Mexico or elsewhere when I was assistant secretary, the question I kept having was, are we going to reach kids? I call them kids even though they're older than my own in some cases. Are we going to reach kids who never had an opportunity or never thought they'd have an opportunity to do study abroad, or whatever it was we were launching, right? Learn English through Access English, Jóvenes en Acción, which is our high school program in Mexico, or 100,000 Strong, which is educational exchange at the college level. Are we going to reach kids who never thought they'd have that chance, and their parents didn't have it, et cetera? Because if we reach the same pool, as I think was also discussed, who have always gone on these educational exchanges. To my mind, even if the numbers go up in the annual surveys, we will have failed dismally. And so broadening that pool was a big question. One of the first people we talked to, and I remember having this conversation, was Peter McPherson, who at that point had left Michigan State and was running the American Public and Land Grant Universities. And one of the things he said is, if you really want to increase the numbers, you need to do this wholesale, not retail. And we were at the very early stages. And many of the companies or other participants that we talked to really like the idea of funding scholarships, right? They like to see fulano who goes off to a college and it's with his money, et cetera. And I understand that. But what McPherson said is, if you create the institutional linkages, essentially, if you build it, they will come. And if you create those institutional linkages, your numbers will go up faster, but you'll also be creating relationships more broadly and more long-lasting, more sustainable between educational institutions that will outlast any pause in funding or change in administration or anything like that. So I think that was one of the biggest things that we focused on. But I was struck in this paper from a policy perspective that it has among the best talking points any bureaucrat could ever use. If you look at a statistic that says for every additional year of education, property and violent crime is reduced by 11% and homicide by 30%. And we talk about countries like Mexico, in which the violence last year was among the worst ever, and there were 29 to 30,000 people killed, or the Central American countries in the Northern Triangle, and we wrestle with migration in which, yes, some people are coming for purely economic reasons, but clearly many people are coming fleeing violence. Then what more efficient investment could the U.S. government have for the policy benefit of reducing violence and reducing migration at its root than to invest in education? So to me, that makes huge sense from a policy perspective. The problem for policymakers, especially U.S. policymakers right now, is we work in one-year budget cycles. And we're under the damn, GPRA, the Government's Performance Results Act. And, if I can't show you metrics that prove that my investment pays off like tomorrow, then I may not get that funding to keep it up for 5 or 10 years or a generation. And that is really what's needed, is some persistence at this. But the second thing that we focused really heavily on in a lot of our programs, and I think is essential, and it was spoken about previously precisely for policy reasons, is that gap, that brecha that we have between finishing high school with clearly, even in a quality high school, not enough skills to enter a job market for the 21st century, and a 4-year college degree, which results in anthropologists driving cabs, right? There's this need for the technical and vocational training. And in Mexico, that was not as hard to do because of the nationwide system of polytechnicos and institutos técnicos that exist there. What I don't know, and it may have been in the study, but I'm not sure I read it, is whether in the countries that we're looking at most specifically, from my perspective, most importantly from a policy perspective, the Northern Triangle countries, do those same kinds of counterparts exist? And my suspicion is not as well organized in any way, in any case. The second thing I would say is, from a policy perspective, unless you have real government buy-in on this, and that doesn't always mean a Brazil-sized government-funded program, but it may mean real commitment to educational reform and real commitment to put some skin in the game in terms of their budget, then we really ought not to do it, because it's not going to succeed. But finally, I would say that we ought to, in general, and I know there have been successes, Jamaica was mentioned in the study, we really, really, really ought to stay away from being directly involved ourselves in educational policy reform. It's controversial enough in this country, let alone elsewhere. And I'm not sure it does us much good to end up with an education reform that even remotely or marginally has made in the USA stamped on it or brought to you by the good people of USAID. It is not that we shouldn't be sharing experiences and what works and what doesn't in other circumstances and putting together people who are smart and have thought about this. But I think our best efforts are used elsewhere. I will say that the number of U.S. institutions that came to see me while I was in Mexico because they were interested in opening, expanding, or otherwise increasing their presence in Mexico was enormous from places you might not have thought. And I'm interested in the way that can facilitate many of our foreign policy goals as well. A dozen or more institutions have offices at UNAM, Mexico's National University in Mexico City. Many have their own offices. What's interesting is we don't see many campuses, right? Part of that is proximity. There's not as much reason if you're going to United Arab Emirates or someplace, you open a campus, let's say. They've also had a lot more money put into that. There have been 2 campuses opened in Mexico of U.S. institutions, one very small, one University of Arkansas, a little bit larger. I would love to see more facilities opened that were shared. I think that would make a huge difference both in deepening the ideas that those universities have about the countries that they're sending kids to, frankly, and where they're operating. But I also think it would attract students from around the country that might not otherwise know about Purdue or the Colorado College of Mines or elsewhere. The fact that we have 25 or 26 Education USA offices in Mexico, a number of them opened when I was there, I think is critical. Those are not, when students in the U.S. want to study overseas, their point of entry is a Ministry of Education that basically has all of the university system and technical education sort of under its purview. It doesn't work like that in the U.S. It's highly decentralized. And therefore, kids who say, I'd like to go to nursing school, have no idea where they might do that or where it would be best for them to do it, because they're going back to Oaxaca and they're going to need certain kinds of skills. So I think that those are critical. But I think that the biggest problem that we have right now is I've seen a lot of attraction on educational exchanges and other models in the Andes, in Brazil, in Mexico. I have not seen, and my folks in the State Department may tell me differently, but I have not seen a whole lot of interest in the places I feel like it's needed most. Central America, parts of the Caribbean, et cetera. So how do we attract private sector funders if we know that from a policy, violence prevention, and even a growing of the middle class as consumers of American products perspective, that's where we need to do more. And I think that's where we've got to have a much harder push on the private sector, and that's something I could talk about for hours, but I won't. And then finally, I thought it was interesting, the discussion of research and joint research and increasing research opportunities. I think that we need to be thinking about this as a spectrum of foreign policy opportunities, whether we're working with high school students in Jóvenes en Acción or other things. We now have 2 Jóvenes en Acción, which is our high school program, who have gone all the way through high school, college, and become Fulbright Garcia Robles scholars, which is really exciting. And the Jóvenes en Acción come from socioeconomic level that is not elite, and they often come from indigenous areas. We had our first indigenous female student who got an MBA after getting an MBA in the United States after doing a year abroad at that college in West Virginia. She went back, having been invited on a full scholarship to get an MBA. These are transformational programs if we target rural, indigenous, women, lower socioeconomic levels. But on the research side, I'm fine with doing more research. I think that's a great idea, unless and until we can change a situation that I see in Latin America where there's a gap between research and commercialization. I'm not sure that's going to provide us with as much as we'd like, because there's still both legal impediments as well as funding, venture capital, et cetera, impediments that are structural. But I'm all for doing more research and more advanced studies so that we can have this spectrum that runs from high school through college, into post-grad and research, and should have within it, and this is critical too, apprenticeships and internships as part of this experience. So I'll stop because I think that's probably more than you wanted to hear from me.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks, Roberta.
But I will also say that in rough times of bilateral or multilateral relationships, educational policy, educational exchanges, these kinds of programs are literally like the oil can for the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. They are the things that suavizar the relationship. They're the positive side of the relationship. And they're critically important to keep going for the resilience of relationships that may be under stress.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm not going to pursue the Wizard of Oz analogies, but however tempting it might be to pick up other points. Anyway, let me turn to Miguel if I could, and pick up right where Roberta just left off, maybe just saying from a Latin American perspective, from Peru's perspective, to what extent, do these programs of cooperation and education really make a difference in the overall relationship? In your perspective, and you have not only been Peru's ambassador here, but also working for multilateral banks, and you've seen the education work being done there. Are there certain particular areas that you think really yield better results if one has to sort of maximize impact that you see as particularly promising from where you sit?
Well, thank you, Michael. It's, as always, very nice to be here, and particularly to reconnect with Roberta. It is an honor to have been serving with her here in the U.S. So let me talk about the bilateral part, and let me talk about, I think, the role of IFIs and multilateral development banks, which I think may complement this discussion, because a way that the U.S. and other big countries can have an effect is through the banks that they are shareholders of. So from the perspective of a country such as Peru or a middle-income country in Latin America, one of the key constraints to actually break this middle-income trap phenomenon, of low growth where we are, is by developing the right skill sets for our labor force, especially in countries that have opened up. You have free trade agreements with most of the world, but if you don't have the skill sets to be able to compete in markets, the openness can actually be a backlash, because you have youth that is, unemployed or underemployed, and expectations that were not fulfilled. So, and that obviously is the seed for unrest and for, supporting, radical changes in governments. So I think this is important, and if you add this discussion of the future of work, which is quite of a fashion to talk about the future of work, the role of the digital, the automation, etc. Usually when you have these shocks, they're positive because they boost productivity, they boost well-being. But do we have, in Latin America, do we have the skills to take advantage of this technology, of this digital revolution? And the answer perhaps is no, we don't. So definitely this is a key area of policy priority for countries that want to progress to the next level. And let me tie this also to a foreign policy agenda, which is the SDGs and 2030 agenda. Goal 4 is quality education. And you look at the different goals out of the 17, a lot of them have to do with education. Now, gender parity has to do with education. Opportunities have to do with education. So this is something that is very, very important and was agreed upon by by all countries in the world in 2015. And in spite of, progress and limited progress in some regard, it's still quite an important set of ambitious goals to be met. So from our perspective, from the perspective of this is very important, to be able to boost growth and opportunities, and actually to be able to meet more ambitious developmental challenges, as said in the 2030 agenda. And in this, I think IFIs, multilateral development banks, have a key role to play as partners to countries in the region. So before going into this bilaterally, with the U.S. we did a lot of interesting work. The 100,000 strong program of exchanges was very good because it also enabled private sector participation to be part of the equation, which is very important. But also, I remember that we were able to actually diversify our foreign policy and our bilateral ties with the U.S. to work not only with the federal government, but with different states, which some of them are countries, the size of countries, working with, and I have some former colleagues here in the audience. We were trying to actually pursue agreements and MOUs to be able to have more educational exchanges with state universities. And even when we were trying to pursue, English as a second language priority, there were ways that we were trying to do this with different states, and that actually enriches the relationship that we have with the U.S. beyond, the central government or the federal programs that are in place, be them in the State Department or the White House or others. So now, from the perspective, I think of the multilateral development banks, you look at this 2030 agenda and this call for action to scale up, what we need to do, and definitely this is a key area of work. And there's different ways that we can actually, and let me stress 3 ways that MDBs and particularly the bank where I work, the Inter-American Development Bank, and I'm sure others are quite committed to. So understanding really what pays off better when you are pursuing, policies and you're making loans or technical assistance to countries, is very important. So the knowledge part and understanding really what are the channels of policy with higher impact are critical. For us and the work that we've done at the IDB, the quality of teaching is very, very important. And here, we've had this really, really interesting experience of study that for 7 years, we've been able to follow a cohort of students for 7 years in Ecuador. And we've been able to do a test of putting, 200 students, divide them in 2 groups. And they were placed purposely in an experiment in an enabling environment with better teachers, and then with less, less experienced, less capable teachers, and see what were the performance of those students in both groups, following 7 years of studying the same student, over 7-year cycle. And that sort of going to the micro level with this longitudinal data, survey data, gave us tremendous information about the quality of teachers, which actually does matter. When we talk about educational quality education, and goes beyond really the PISA type of analysis that we're always laggards in the PISA score evaluations, and try to dig in what exactly can affect an improvement in such indicator. So in this particular study, we were able to find that those with better teachers were 1 year ahead in terms of their learning outcomes and performance, vis-a-vis the group that was with the less, with the less prepared teachers. So putting the focus on teaching and putting the focus on performance of students is critical. And this is one example of the different ways that we can actually try to understand what best works and try to use our proximity with our clients, our role as our convening power, and us regarded as honest brokers, MDVs usually, to be able to enact policy changes in this area. I think a second area has to do with the sort of instruments we deploy. Because usually, institutions such as, the World Bank, where I worked in the past, or CAF, where I worked in the past, or now IDB, we are focused in traditional loans, or investment loans, or policy-based loans. But there is a recent change in which we're trying to actually go away from inputs and think about outcomes. And we are actually experiencing with loan based on results. And we actually had a very interesting loan that was given to Uruguay. I was approved for Uruguay last year, in which we actually tied disbursements to the achievement of learning in the learning of students. So it's no longer that we're thinking about deploying our resources to pay for teachers or pay for infrastructure, but actually it is resources that are that are free for governments as long as they meet the particular learning achievement set in that loan. So shifting towards outcomes, I think it's promising way. In a different area, such as healthcare, we had working in partnerships with other institutions, such as the Gates Foundations for Central America and the Iniciativa Salud Mesoamericana. Also with the same logic of results-based, we work with technical assistance with grant money to be able to improve the health care of pregnant mothers and their children when they were born. So this idea of focusing to outcomes is very important. And the third and perhaps most promising area is developing financial tools to mobilize resources and using innovation in this sense. And let me just give you two examples. Social impact bonds, which is something new. I think there's a lot of experience of this in India initially. And we've had a very interesting one with the MIF at our group, working with Colombia. It was a 750,000 social impact bond that was structured along with private investors and foundations, the Santo Domingo Foundation, Da Vivienda, and others in Colombia, in which investors that buy these bonds get repaid as long as the results are met. In this case, investors are repaid if unemployed or vulnerable Colombians find a job or find an opportunity if they're being displaced by the conflict, and they don't get repaid otherwise. So this is, an area of, where there's, we're transferring the financing risk to the investor, and we are focusing on the policy to the governments. And this is something promising, an area of promising intervention for the private sector. And there's one initiative that has been led by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown from the UK, who is pushing this international finance facility for education and getting the support of all MDVs, which is trying to mobilize resources from the private sector and from donors to be able to, through guarantees, be able to mobilize from $2 billion US dollars contributions from donors up to 10 billion of private resources. And this can also enable MDVs to participate as we scale up, mobilizing the private sector. So these are ways in which, we can actually meet, this SDG, ambitious developmental agenda, and we can help countries to achieve, results, which is, I think, what most citizens are demanding from their governments. A lot of this disenfranchised societies is because of the lack of quality services that they're not receiving from their governments. And this is actually exacerbated when who gives the service is a local or a subnational government, where capacities are weaker. So definitely, thinking about ways that we can actually pursue more cooperation, and countries such as the U.S. being one of the main shareholders of these institutions, of banks, of development banks, we can actually think about pursuing ways and bring in the private sector and use our knowledge, experience, our technical advice, and our financial strength to bring resources and best practices. So I end that funding and resources is not the panacea. When I was finance minister at my time, we increased the budget almost 1 point of GDP. Once I got there, and it was a tremendous fiscal effort. With the time of when resources were more, there was more abundance at the time. But that didn't resolve the problem. It's not only, giving more resources, they're going to get, magical results in terms of quality education, in terms of learning outcomes and skill development. But definitely there's important ways that we can pool efforts from the bilateral and foreign policy with ambitious goals and have IFIs partner with recipient countries and our shareholders to be able to have quality education as the report correctly signals.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Miguel. I think we've had two excellent sets of remarks looking at both the bilateral aid cooperation side and also some of the multilateral, more complementary ideas and programs from some of the banks. Our time is quite limited, and so what I'd suggest, I have a list of questions, but I'd rather try to get 1 or 2 questions in from this very knowledgeable and engaged audience for both the ambassador and also for the ambassador.
Exactly. The ambassador and
the ambassador as well as the ambassador.
Michael, can I make one more comment?
Sure, please.
Miguel talked about some innovative financing ideas and transferring risk on financing to the investors and outcome-based investments. But I think one of the things AID has done in the past, for example, in, I think, largely non-educational programming, these were other kinds of programs, is I know it worked in a place like Salvador, and we actually employed it in Mexico for the first time last year, which was to insist, to demand that a particular program have 1-to-1, 2-to-1, whatever the percentage was of private sector, local private sector input. You have to put X amount of money on the table for us to pony up our 2 million, 8 million, whatever it is. And that was relatively new. And I think that if we're looking at things like education outcomes or exchange programs, et cetera, that has to be, to me, that has to be required. Obviously, some of our models are largely private sector, like 100,000 Strong. In others, it's, shared, like Jóvenes en Acción. But to my mind, if you don't get that commitment going in from the local private sector to put some skin in the game, they also have to be part of the conversation about the skills that they're looking for and the kinds of coursework that will result in the people they want to employ. But if you don't get that up front, too many of the private sectors in too many countries around the region, they're fine to do their own foundation work, but they consider this a government function, so they don't really want to kick in. And that those days are over. They've got to be part of the solution.
Great point. Thank you. I don't get here, one here, and then two over there. Yes, please.
Thank you.
You have a microphone?
My name is Susana Cabrillo, and I'm wearing different hats here. I'm on the board of NAFSA, but I'm also consulting for SENAI, the Brazilian Workforce and Skills Development group in Brazil. I thank you so much for this great event. I think there are a lot of issues that were highlighted, and as it was said before, there needs to be a more in-depth discussion. So 2 weeks ago, I was in the NAFSA annual conference in Philadelphia, and we had the Latin America Forum, and a lot of the issues that were discussed here came up. And we felt that we needed more policy dialogue around the key challenges that the region is facing. And then this week, I attended 2 events. One linked to the private sector role in development and the new funding instruments. And I was really surprised was one example that was a successful partnership between private sector and a local NGO in India, and the head of the NGO went through the whole process about developing this funding instrument. It took them about 3 or 4 years because private sector wants to see concrete results. Nobody's going to put money if they will not see the returns on their investments. And he was saying that it took about 100 copies or versions of an MOU. It's not an easy task. So I was wondering if there is any example of a successful case in Latin America beyond Mexico, Colombia, or the outliers, countries that really need support like Peru, Central America, Bolivia. And the second point that I wanted to make is there definitely needs to be more policy dialogue in the countries involving the private sector, because from my experience, I was born in Latin America and I worked many years in the region. The mindset of the private sector in some of our countries in the region is totally outdated. They are not committed, they are not engaged, and how can we help rethink and change that mindset?
Great, thank you. We have 2 questions, and then we'll turn it back to the panel. Yes, over there.
Hi there, Sarah Beth Berman from Teach for All. You mentioned some of the innovative financing models that are outcomes focused, and you also talked about some of the pressures that we get for immediate outcomes in order to maintain funding. The report, which admittedly I've only been able to skim while sitting here, I noticed mentioned the need for balancing educational outcomes while also investing in capacity building and longer term capacity systems to support educational outcomes. I'd be interested in how some of these innovative financing models can also fund some of the longer term capacity building programming and efforts that are necessary alongside looking at immediate outcomes.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Andrea Cristancho. Thank you both for your very insightful points. My question is more focused on a point that was raised on results-based studies and lessons learned. Obviously, the dialogue has done a really great job at gathering data. USAID has really great websites, like USAID Explore, where data are being gathered from not only USAID, but the World Bank, the UN, and so forth. But I feel like a lot of this information is not disseminated to folks who can actually have a greater impact on project implementation and so forth. So I'm wondering how do we, with all this information that we have, and obviously everyone here in the room is interested on what the data is telling us, how do we do a better job at disseminating information not only to local stakeholders, but government and private public folks who are interested in actually making the change that the data are showing us?
Great. Thank you very much. Why don't we go back to our, do you have a question? No. Do you have a question? You do? Okay, one brief question, final question.
Thank you. My name is Luis. My wife Mercy. We are here. We were born in Peru. We are U.S. citizens. But we have the same interest to help in education. We are running our own project, helping students to go into the college and running a small project. BC, go to BC with cycle to the college, and helping a principal. Two basic ideas, because education is a huge problem in all around South America. I think it's the same for the State Department or for the Minister of Economy in Peru. It's the same. We want to find a solution, practical solution to help them. And we chose this. Help principals and help a student go to school. And this is a basic idea, only a simple and basic idea. And I think we are here to try to find something practical to run it in the area. And I am pretty sure all we are interested with this. And I think the State Department can help us to share all the ideas, to all the opportunities, to talking about practical solutions, to run practical solutions in the field. We don't need big, only one side of the world solution. We need listen everybody and working together because the education is a big challenge for everybody.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Very brief. And then we go back to, we'll start with Miguel and then Roberta. Very brief comment. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. My name is Javier Arguello. I run an R&D in applied cognitive science. My concern is that we may be chasing the wrong indicator to predict and improve the success of students, and I'd like your comments on this. All of the indicators that I read about tend to be based on academic performance, which is completely decoupled from learning. And we know learning is a cognitive process. We can actually assess cognition. We can predict failure. We can predict success. And cognition is malleable. And the best thing we can do for a student is to enhance their ability to learn. And the best thing we can do for a student is to make the science of learning explicit to how students are taught. These two things don't exist at all, to my knowledge, in any initiative that I've seen in Latin America. And if we succeed at PISA, we could still fail at their future because it's measuring the wrong thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Miguel, you want to start? Any of these, you know, respond to all of these questions about anything you want to pick up on, any point you want to make, and then we'll turn to Roberta.
Sure. I also do the same caveat. I'm not an education specialist, so in terms of the question of changing the mindset of the private sector, I think we shouldn't underestimate that, you know, out of necessity, given that they don't have the right skills to be able to grow and to compete, etc. I think the private sector has, you know, it's seen the importance of getting more skilled, appropriate skills, and obviously investment since the early childhood all the way through vocational training and higher education is something, you know, that it's becoming increasingly internalized by not all, but I think by many key business leaders in different countries. Of course, you know, it is because it's a necessity for them, given the constraints that they're facing. There's always room for more, of course. But I think the fact that you're seeing, you know, investors investing in this sort of vehicles, you know, I think it's indicative that this is becoming more and more mainstreamed in different countries, although, you know, still there are limitations. In terms of when we focus on outcome-based, it doesn't mean that we're leaving aside capacity building, you know, basic capacity building exercises. So one can think about hybrid, you know, type of interventions. You can have investment or policy-based loans to improve capacity building alongside this result-based loan. So you can think about a menu of options available. But really, when one looks and one quantifies the resources that are approved on a yearly basis towards developing countries and Latin American countries, and you look at the results, then there's a big question mark. So, what are we achieving? And it's been billions and billions of US dollars being intermediated towards these sectors, and the results have been, absent in some cases. Regarding the dissemination of best practices, well, I think forums such as this are a great way to go, but I think there needs to be a conscience. In my home country in Peru, there is conscience that to be able to actually develop as a country, and we need to solve, and this perhaps one of the only issues beyond soccer, which began an hour ago. The first team, by the way, Russia, Saudi Arabia. It's to see the importance of being here in this neglecting the World Cup.
Historic moment.
And I lost my train of thought there, but for whether. I was gonna say something about dissemination. So I think it is forum like this, and the consensus you can reach in certain countries that, there's consensus about the need to improve the quality of education abstractly. So now the devil lies in the detail. How do we go about that? Knowing that if we don't solve this, then all the progress that we've achieved so far is gonna reverse. And there is growing consensus among the what, then the how is where the questions lie. Your point about learning, about the metrics, about learning outcomes and cognitive is really very difficult. But I think it's right there where you actually define exactly, it's in the cognitive capabilities. And we use proxies because of lack of better metrics to measure this. But I think it is precisely the cognitive, and especially in the early childhood phase where these cognitive capabilities are developed, that we should focus our attention. So again, I'm no educational expert, but those are issues that we can spend a lot of time, and forums such as this, I think, inform us to be able to keep on deepening our understanding.
Great, thank you.
So two real quick things, because I know people are starting to leave. One, I think you may very well, in fact, I'm sure you're right on the cognitive issue and testing the wrong things. What I'm quite sure of now is that in large measure, students in the region are not getting either, right? They're not being taught to the tests, clearly, and they're not being taught how to think, right? How to reason, how to think, how to solve problems, which is the cognitive part of this. So in the Mexican example, there is a very profound educational reform that was undertaken by this administration in Mexico precisely for that reason, because the recognition that largely this was memorization and rote and non-interactive classrooms in some of the better places was failing their students. And they really did look at the pedagogy and the way kids were going to learn. The problem, setting aside your very valid concerns about whether they're ultimately going to be even testing the kids correctly, but one of the big problems that the study points out is it is, like so many things in Mexico, a very good reform, which is now the subject of politicization during the electoral campaign, and it is associated with the current government in such a way that it is not likely to survive in the same form, at least, across administrations. And we know that that's bad, that having only that short time to try and implement it. And one of the most crucial factors that became one of the most political was evaluation of teachers, was improving the quality of teachers. let alone finding out how many ghost teachers you had who weren't even actually performing their duties. So I think you're right, and I hope that my impression from some of the conversations with Mexican counterparts in the education ministry was that they were bringing in a lot of experts as they looked at that, at the curricula that they were trying to change and at the outcomes they would measure later. But I'm afraid they may not even get that far. Because these things, the best of these outcomes, I think, as the study points out, have to be trans-administration. They have to survive. The last thing I would say, in terms of the dissemination, I know that there are people from embassies here. That's one of the ways we hope that you will take things back and disseminate through governments at all levels, you know, what you hear here, the study, et cetera. But it's one of the reasons that I think strongly developed civil society mechanisms are crucial too. NGOs that follow education issues who can play that mediating, facilitating role of gathering up the information that is going around the world or around the region and disseminating it in their home country, whether digitally or via interviews, et cetera, but also holding policymakers accountable for what they say they're going to do and demanding in the context of whether it's local, federal, national elections or budget reviews, accountability to be doing what they said they were going to do. And that really does include the budget component as well as the policy component, because there's been a lot of blah, blah without frankly, the money to back up. It doesn't necessarily mean that money is the answer, but it sure as hell can't be done without any money. So those are.
It's dialogue. We say the same thing here. Let me, first of all, let me just say there was one question that I was going to ask you, but we're not going to have time for it, but maybe you can both think about it and then let me know. And also, all of you could think about it, which is what, in light of all of this discussion today, what should the dialogue be doing that we're not doing? Are there things that we should be focusing on and
help
we're
connect
not?
people with small projects into bigger sort of cooperatives, so it has a larger impact.
But we would welcome that, I think, for Ariel and his great team, because the dialogue also wants to be part of this effort. And if there's some things, given characteristics as a policy center, as a policy forum, that you think could be useful, we'd appreciate any thoughts that you might have. I want to say that I want to thank Ambassador Jacobson, Ambassador Castilla, Roberta, and Miguel for being here. Really, they are real troopers. Roberta recently had foot surgery, as you can see, and so it hasn't been easy to get around. And Miguel arrived this morning from Japan and is leaving today for Peru, for Lima.
God, what time is it for you?
This is really above and beyond for both of you, and I really, really am very, very grateful for you for being with us. I also, as a final word, let me just again congratulate Ariel and Sarah on a first-rate report and for such terrific work, and really has been recognized by everybody here, I think, and hope will give it impetus for going forward. I really commend this report, and it's just perfect for reading between games of the World Cup. It's the perfect reading material when you go from one World Cup to another, and if you have a few to drink, it's even better. So thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you again.